Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing my book wrap-up for the month of February. So last month I ended up reading 6 books in total, and there's one extra book that I ended up DNFing after a little bit less than 100 pages or so. So it's not like I read a huge amount of books in the month of February, which is a shorter month, so I'm going to give that excuse to myself, but also just read the amount of books that felt right for the amount of work that I've had as well to do. So it was just the perfect amount of books. The first book that I finished was Anxious People by Frederick Backman. So I read this as part of a little reading book club that I have with 2 of my friends, and really enjoyed this book. This tells the story of a bank robbery gone wrong, and the person who tried to rob that bank ends up going into an apartment viewing where there's a bunch of people there to view the apartment, and takes all of them hostage. And I'm using air quotes by saying hostage just because it's a terrible bank robber who doesn't really even know how to use their gun. Half of the people there think that the gun is fake anyway, and everyone in there is kind of a mess, and they all just have like very messy lives like normal people, really. Just they all have a certain past and a certain backstory that they're carrying with them, and that kind of comes into play in the story, and it just became really fun and interesting and amusing to read, even though it talks about like extremely heavy topics, including things like suicide and everything, and depression, but in a way that is so light and funny, and just makes you feel like understood whenever you read all of these things. So I adored Frederick Backman writing. I discovered this. I had no idea I would love this book so much. I just thought he had such an amazing humor that really allowed you to dive into heavy and deep topics like that, but without feeling scared of it and without feeling the anxiety of these topics. So it was very interesting. Definitely a 5-star read for me, which was such a good start to the month as well. And I immediately picked up another book by Frederick Backman afterwards that I'm gonna be reading next month, I think, which is Bear Town. So yeah, very excited for this and for me to discover more books by this author. The next 2 books that I read were graphic novels. They're mangas. Actually, I believe that they're manhwas. I'm not sure how to pronounce that correctly, but I believe that's the difference between mangas or comic novels, comic books coming from Japan, and manhwas are coming from Korea, from what I understand. So I read 2 of these, and I am counting them as books, yes, because although they are graphic novels, both of them were about 600 pages, so definitely counting those in my Goodreads challenge. They are called Bloody Sweet Volume 1 and Volume 2 by Nare Lee, and they're basically telling the story of this girl who gets bullied in high school, and she is always treated badly by her classmates because her mom is a female shaman. I forgot the term for it, there's a specific term for that, but basically because of that everyone else is acting as if she's a witch, and she's creepy and all that, and I guess she kind of falls into that category slowly without, you know, by default, just because everyone is treating her as such, so she almost becomes that creepy character who just doesn't talk to anyone and accepts, I guess, the bullying that is happening to her. But one day, because this story is also supernatural in nature, she meets with this character that is basically a vampire, but he calls her master because as soon as they meet, I think she gets hurt slightly or something, and he licks her blood, and it ties him to her because she's a witch. And so what happens is that he has to now become her servant, pretty much, and treats her like she's his master. And he acts a little bit like a golden retriever puppy dog, and is just very cutesy and very funny and much more lighthearted than the undertone of bullying and all the things that really deserve a little bit of a trigger warning if you go into this book, because there's a lot about anxiety, depression, suicide and all that. So all of that is very dark, but then the actual story itself is super cute, and there's an adorable love story there, but also friendship, and just there's a few other characters in there that come into play. And what I loved about this is that you really see the evolution, like the character development that you see of the main character is so good, and I loved that. And then the second volume focuses on her after she's finished high school, and she's trying to be a real life shaman like her mother, and all of her friends are now in uni and you kind of have more of their lives as well, and it focuses a lot more on the backstory of the vampire main character, of the vampire guy. So you have a lot more about his past, how he became a vampire, enemies that he's made along the way that kind of come into play and come to try and take him back, I guess. So there's a lot about that, and it was just such a cutesy tale and just so nice to read. Loved it. You'll be able to see more about this book when I finally publish it in one of my secret TBR videos. So when it comes out, hopefully next month, you'll get more information about it. But overall, really recommend these two books, and I rated both of them 4 stars. The next book I read was Waking Gods by Silva Novell, and this is a second book in a trilogy. So the trilogy in question is the Themis Files, Themis or Themis, I'm never sure how to pronounce this in English, but basically the first book was called Sleeping Giants and the second one is Waking Gods. And this is about people start finding pieces of what looks to be a gigantic alien robot thing and put them together, and they call her in the end Themis, which is why it's called the Themis Files. So the first book was really fun. I remember reading it so long ago now, before the second and third had come out, and then I took ages in between the first and the second book, and I finally read the second book because a friend of mine tried to start the trilogy as well, so I was like, well, when you get to the second one, I'll read it with you so that I have a little bit of a buddy read going on. I enjoyed myself mostly because it's a very fast read. These books are written in a format that is interviews and reports and stuff like that, mostly interviews, so it's just a lot of dialogue. And because it's sci-fi, the only reason why it might be a little bit slower than normal just plain dialogue is because there is still a lot of explanations as to the scientific nature of things that are happening, and sometimes it's a little bit of a heavy scientific, you know, dialogue going on that you're like, I don't understand what's going on, I'll skip a little bit through that. But I did enjoy myself. The only thing that I was disappointed in is a lot of the stuff that happens to some of the main characters. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but there is a plot point in there that is about one of the characters having a child. And the fact is, at the very beginning and in the first book, this character says very clearly that they never ever want to become a mother, and that they never want to have a child. And then this becomes a plot point, like it becomes a story point that is super important, and a child does happen. It's a very weird way, so I'm not gonna give any spoilers as to how, but there is something to do with a child at some point and this character, and it was very disappointing to read because that should not become a plot point in a story like that. That should never have been used against her. And as a woman myself who doesn't want to have children, fucking respect that. Like, it's not that hard to understand that some women don't see how that's ever going to be a thing for them, and it's absolutely okay in today's society to think that way. So why was that used as a freaking plot point? Really disappointed in that, and I think that's why I ended up rating it 3 stars, because I did enjoy myself and I didn't want to rate it too low either, because I do intend on reading the third book in the trilogy as well. I do like the guy's writing style. Silva Novell has written other stuff. He's written The Test, which is a very small 100 pages novella, and it was very well written and amazing, and I love that. So I'm just gonna blame it on this being one of his earlier pieces of work, and hopefully we can move on from that. Next, I read Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and I really enjoyed myself reading this one. So this one tells the story of a band in the 70s. So this is a fictional band, but a lot of people have said that Taylor Jenkins Reid was highly inspired by Fleetwood Mac and the story of Fleetwood Mac, including Stevie Nicks as the main singer at some point and how famous they got and everything. And this is very similar in nature, I guess, to some of that story. It's also set in an interview format. This is pretty much you're reading the transcript of interviews that someone is doing because they're writing a book about the band, so they're interviewing whoever has accepted or remains to tell the story of the band from the 70s. So you're like reading from our present day point of view about this band that was big in the 70s and that pretty much made one album that like topped the charts for ages and was amazing and everything, and then they broke up, and this is the story of how and why they broke up and what happened. This book pretty much focuses on 2 main characters, I want to say, which is Daisy Jones, who is the singer of the band. And then the Six is actually another band originally that then merges with Daisy Jones. And the Six has a few characters in there and you follow all of them as well. But there's one guy in particular that you follow that is kind of the leader of the band. So you have mostly a lot of stuff about these two and what happens in their life and how they came to become who they are in this story. And there's a lot to do with drugs. Like, I don't think there's a single page in this book that doesn't mention drugs at some point. It has a lot to do with, you know, the realization of being an addict and how to overcome that, and that there is, you know, a few of these deeper topics and that are quite deep and intense in the book. But overall it was still a light read. It's a lot about, you know, their music, how it came to be, the tensions between people, all of the interpersonal relationships between them. There's a lot in there and it was just so fun and so interesting, and it just felt like reading the lives of real celebrities but in a fictional format and with fictional celebrities. I do have to say though that I rated it 5 stars, but it would be in my head a lower 5 stars than Evelyn Hugo, which I read first, although she wrote it second, I think. But basically Evelyn Hugo to me had a lot more characters that I really genuinely loved and rooted for, while Daisy Jones and the Six, as amusing as it was to read, I wasn't really rooting for anyone. Everyone was a little bit of a dickhead at one time or another, at the very least. So it didn't feel like I cared as much, but it was just really fun and enjoyable to read about them and just entertaining, really. So it didn't matter as much to me reading this book. I was happy to read it even though I didn't like the characters and who they were, mostly because it was in an interview format. So I think maybe that's what made it more enjoyable to read about people that are hateable. But Evelyn Hugo generally had people that made me feel more because I cared way more about them. So that's the only difference I would say between the two 5 stars that I've given these two books. Next, I read Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. This is a thick boy. This is a YA contemporary fantasy novel, and basically it tells the story of Bree, who is this teenager who I think she's like 16 or something, and she has just lost her mother in a car accident, and she is leaving to go to this half high school, half university. It's like a pre-university type of setting where kids are, you know, staying in dorms and everything, and kind of taking some topics that are going to help them in university later, I guess. I'm not entirely sure about the concept of this. I'm sure that it's real and that it exists, I just don't know anything about it. But basically that's where she's going to. So she's going to this very prestigious school that is part of a university as well. So it's on a campus, I think. And when she goes there, she slowly gets involved in some sort of secret society where people have powers that are pretty much based off and taken from Arthurian legend stuff. I'm not going to explain much more than that because it does go into spoiler land if I do, but it was so fun, so interesting, so magical. Loved the main character. Hated her best friend and all the people that were like annoying me throughout the story because they didn't know about the magical power stuff and they were getting in the way of things. Really enjoyed the other characters, the side characters that were in the story when she met them in the secret society. There's a little bit of a 2 main guys. I want to say there's one that she does get with quite early on, and you kind of get a feeling that that might not be her endgame, but this is only book 1 and there's more than book 1. And then there's the other guy who kind of starts more as a enemies to lover potential trope, which I actually did really hate at the beginning because I was like, he's just a toxic dickhead, like, don't care about that. But then slowly you do get to like him more. I kind of went on a roller coaster about him. I went like up and down about how I felt about him, but by the end of it I did like that character and the relationship that he has with Bree, which evolves as well throughout this book, and that relationship really made me like him more. So I'm not going to give any spoilers as to what happens, and obviously there is another book coming, so it does end on a cliffhanger for a bunch of things in this book, but it was just so enjoyable. And there's a lot as well about the relationship that Bree has with 2 types of magic, because she is also she's a black student in a school that has a lot of white students, and the secret society is pretty much just white kids. Bree comes in with some of her own family magic as well, which is called brute magic, and is pretty much, you know, rooted in the belief that everything that they take is not just given, it is using something else's power and life So it's not just for free, and there's like a payment to give almost to use this magic. There's a lot of interesting ideas in there that I thought were fascinating and made for such a good world building and an interesting lore behind everything in this. So 100% recommend this book if you're into that kind of genre, because it was so fun, and I rated it 5 stars, and it 100% deserves those 5 stars. There's a few chapters as well that definitely made me cry or almost cry, and I was like, this is very deep, and like, wow, loved it. Absolutely loved it and recommend it. Finally, this is the last book that's on my pile from last month, but this is my DNF, and this was The Night Itself by Zoe Marriott. So I read about 76 pages, I think, from what I remember, of this book, and I did enjoy slightly what I was reading. It wasn't bad. It wasn't anything that I was like, wow, this is awful or so bad, like when I read Hush Hush, that was just bad. This isn't just bad. It just wasn't that entertaining. I didn't enjoy myself that much. I was kind of like dragging my feet to pick up this book and realized I just didn't really want to pick it up. And this has been my new resolution for this year, and I've tried and managed to so far to do it in the only 2 months that we've had so far in the year. But my new resolution was definitely to not finish reading a book that I'm not enjoying that much, except Hush Hush, because there was an entertaining value to that, I guess. But I was just dragging my feet here, it wasn't fun, and I was filming a video with this book in there, and I was just like, this is making this video take so much more time than it should be, because I'm not reading this book, so I can't film anything, I can't talk about it, and I can't talk about how it ends and go on to the next book. So was not working for me. Decided to DNF it. Nothing that bad to say about this book. It just felt much more middle grade to me than it did young adult, and I think I can kind of tell from the synopsis, and I should have been able to tell, but I had maybe hoped that it would be more young adult. It's just that it is an older book as well, and I think there was less of a distinction at the time between books that are more on the younger young adult side and books that are more on the adult young adult side, you know, borderline new adult or borderline middle grade. And I would have been happy if it had been in between or more towards the adult side, but it was more towards the middle grade side, and I just did not love that. It wasn't what I was looking for, so happy to just have DNF this one. And that was it. This was the last book in this video that I was going to be talking about, so I guess I will see you guys in my next video. If you liked this, please leave a like, leave a comment down below. I always try to respond. Consider subscribing, ringing that bell, all that jazz, and I will see you guys in the next one.